role-playing game genre is very dear to me. Growing up, I wasn't into movies too much, but I did like reading, and obviously I loved video games. Generally, I just loved stories, and much of my imagination's need for fantasy worlds and characters was filled by the role-playing games of the 90s. Of course, it's common knowledge that the term role-playing game came around long before the 90s. The genre began as a pencil and paper kind of thing, where the players would take on various roles and create a story based on their actions as the game went along. I appreciate the origin of the style, but it wasn't until later that they started getting some set story lineage infused in there. At that point, playing an RPG was like reading a book. There was some fighting and leveling up and maybe some strategy here and there, but for the most part, these classic RPGs were all about the stories, and not so much about making the gameplay innovative. If you've been following my channel for, well, any amount of time, you've probably gathered that I'm drawn to simple, compelling games. These days, most games play out more like movies. The more cinematic, the better. I'm not saying that's bad, but there is something to be said for the less is more approach. Back when a game didn't have multi-million-dollar budgets and ultra-realistic graphics, the backbone of the game itself had to be entertaining, whether that meant the story or the engine, or preferably both. I played a ton of old RPGs, but only a handful still stand out to me as classics. For a modern gamer who wants to try out some of these titles, I wouldn't just go around picking ones at random, okay? You may end up playing God knows what. Final Fantasy Mystic Quest, Lagoon, Quest 64, some other game with Quest in the title. Horrifying thoughts. Some of the games I played growing up actually did become pivotal in the development of the genre. Others are widely considered to be mediocre, but for some reason, they were good enough to be memorable to me. Now, to be honest, I really can't start this walk down memory lane without mentioning the very first RPG I ever played, the first Final Fantasy game on the NES. But I never even came close to beating it. In fact, I never even beat the very first boss. Why? I didn't know I needed to level up to get stronger, much less how to level up. This was back before, tutorials were a thing. In Final Fantasy, you just picked your characters and hit the road. In my defense, I was about 5. All this said, I can't say I enjoyed my very first RPG experience, but I'm not saying you shouldn't play this game if you want to. It wasn't until a little while later that I was introduced to a very happy medium that paved the way into more traditional turn-based RPGs, Secret of Mana. It did so by, first of all, not being turn-based. It was an adventure game in real time. Secondly, and this is a feature that is still rather unique to this day, but was totally unheard of at the time, it allowed up to 3 players. Quite an odd feature for a role-playing game, but it was extremely effective and led to many all-nighters spent with me and my friends. But whether your friends were playing or not, there were still all 3 characters in the game, and you were able to edit their AI with a slider in the settings menu. Either way, it was a fantastic game, and it even had a bit of a twist at the end. But after a little while, it was about time for me to try the turn-based arena again. Final Fantasy III, as it was then known, but now is called 6 because blah blah blah, no one really cares, was a game I played on and off for quite a long time before I actually finished it. I had to really get into the turn-based style to enjoy playing it since the random encounter rate in this game seems quite high. But this Final Fantasy tells one of the greatest stories of all of them, about power, friendship, and determination. And it also contains the famous opera scene, which may be the greatest 10 minutes of the game, and is still one of the more well-known parts of any Final Fantasy game. And it's got a really awesome bad guy, which I think you should check out this video to learn more about. And you know what, I'm actually glad I got back into the turn-based arena because a little while after that, Earthbound happened. Now, I was actually looking forward to Earthbound for a while before its release, and it's still one of the greatest feats of video game-etude ever to exist. The setting was more modern, and the story was simple and really ridiculous, but it was so touching it might even make Peter Dinklage shed a tear, and the soundtrack was complimentary in a sense that it's strange and creepy, but can also be carefree in some spots. The script writing is, put simply, the best in any RPG I've ever played. It's hilarious and the pop culture references are awesome. I'm not sure why, but I found this game to be pretty tough. First of all, there are enemies everywhere. Not just dungeons, but towns, sometimes even houses in the towns, and when there is a dungeon, it's generally quite long and unforgiving. And lastly, inventory space. Oh man, is it limited. Seriously though, play this game immediately. Jumping back over to the real-time adventure genre, this is a game that truly fell under the radar, but it should be played by anyone who enjoys adventure RPGs. It's a really nice tale of a boy and his dog and how they get transported to a fantasy world and then spend the rest of the game trying to get home. It's built on the same engine as Secret of Mana, but other than the combat and the inventory rings, there really aren't many similarities. The magic system in this game is different from most. Instead of learning spells and using MP, you learn alchemy formulas and use ingredients that you find or buy to execute them. The music mostly serves for ambiance, but is always very complimentary to the environments, and it was composed by none other than Jeremy Soule, the same dude that brought us the soundtracks to Knights of the Old Republic, Morrowind, Oblivion, and Skyrim, and about 900,000 other games. It was also the first Squaresoft game ever to be fully developed in the States, which matters to some people for some reason. Indeed, at the very same time Evermore was in development in 1995, another game was being localized for American release. This was the super hyped Chrono Trigger. This game is still well known today. It did a few things that no other RPG had done yet. Multiple endings depending on when you finished the game, and the new Game Plus feature that let you start the game from the beginning with all your levels and items, making the task of seeing all the endings easy and enjoyable. It also contained a lot of content that wasn't a part of the main story, but was in the game to flesh out characters and obtain special equipment. The music was done by the amazingly awesome Yasunori Mitsuda, and again, is a very highly regarded soundtrack. I don't really know how else to put it. If you want to play a classic game that was innovative in the world of video games and helped make the industry what it is today, truly one of the greatest, you need to play this one. Luckily, it's available pretty much everywhere. For a little while after its release, the PlayStation wasn't exactly a classy console. It had a couple fun games like Twisted Metal and Crash Bandicoot, but it took a little while for Sony to get anything on the console that wasn't pretty much just a throwaway game with these fancy new graphics. Eventually it did get some more robust titles like Tomb Raider, but overall, during this time, my allegiance was still with the Super Nintendo. And while I did have fun with the N64 when it was released, one thing I noticed even back then was the fact that there were simply no RPGs being made anymore. The SNES was the go-to console for the best RPGs in the world, and now on the N64 the closest thing we got was Quest 64, which didn't quite cut it, to put it nicely. And then all of a sudden, I heard that my beloved Squaresoft had ditched Nintendo and headed over to Sony and was going to release Final Fantasy VII on the PlayStation. Well, I mean, it's a legendary Final Fantasy game, so obviously it either has millions of people saying it's the greatest thing ever, or the most overrated thing ever. Whatever your thoughts, upon its release the game took the world by storm. The first time playing the game blind back in 1997 was truly an experience. But this was a far cry from the relatively simple, family-friendly Squaresoft RPGs on the SNES. This was set in a dystopian, somewhat futuristic world with slums, starvation, oppression, gore, injustice, and prostitution. The script was gritty, and for the time it was a little bit shocking. It featured a storyline with plenty of twists and turns, leaving a first-time player asking himself what was really going on throughout most of the game. At the same time, the materia battle system was so fun to mess with, it's still one of my favorites today. What I said about Chrono Trigger also applies to this. If you want to play a classic game that was innovative in the world of video games and helped make the industry what it is today, this is just a must-play. Quite some time after Final Fantasy VII happened, I discovered the magic and beauty that is the Suikoden series. The first Suikoden actually was out in 1996 before Final Fantasy VII, but it got very little attention. Unlike Final Fantasy VII, it went back to simpler times in many ways. It opted for sprite graphics and a simple battle system, and instead focused on a compelling story about political corruption and recruiting enough soldiers for a rebellion. 108 characters, to be exact, can be recruited. The more you get, the easier the game will be. I loved the first Suikoden so much that I immediately bought Suikoden II upon its release, and it became one of the greatest gaming experiences I've ever had and probably ever will have. It improved on Suikoden I in a few small but important ways with the mechanics and graphics, but it was still strictly a story-driven game. The fact that they made this game tie in with the first Suikoden so closely was part of the appeal. If you want to try these games, which I so highly think you should, I think you should play the first one without a guide, just enjoy it, and then play it again with a guide and get everything. Then do that same thing with Suikoden II. The results will be quite awesome, I promise. At some point during all this, I have no idea when, I discovered Final Fantasy Tactics. It's not a traditional RPG, but it is a strategy RPG, so it has to be on this list. And as far as strategy RPGs go, I don't think you'll find in a million billion infinity years one better than this. There's a ton of job classes, a very long, very interesting story, an insane amount of story battles, not to mention random battles. If this game does hook you, you'll be hooked for a very, very long time. And what's worse, the replay value is so amazingly good, you may have to play it a couple times before you're actually satisfied. I currently have this game on my iPhone, and it was basically the best $9.99 I've ever spent. And all this brings us right down to the year 2000, a mere 13 years ago. Jesus Christ, was it really 13 years ago? Man, that's like way over a decade. God. I can't think about that. Alright, in 2000, the best worst game in history was released. Chrono Cross. It was the sequel to Chrono Trigger that we had all been waiting for 5 years. Would it deliver? Well, for more info on that, I would just say check out this video I made that's completely dedicated to trying to figure out if it did or not. But, long story short, Chrono Cross disappointed many fans. My theory is that they tried to market the game as a new title, even though it was very clearly a sequel. And I bet that if they actually did simply make it its own game, not related to Chrono Trigger at all, it probably would have been much better received. Even so, if you can take it for what it is, it's a very solid game with 45 recruitable characters and a storyline that will leave you very confused, no matter how smart you think you are. A couple years later, Morrowind surfaced and pretty much changed the world. I mean, seriously, if you don't know about these games already, I'm officially surprised you have the internet. Back when it was first released on the Xbox, I played Morrowind more or less for half a year. And all that time I got very far, but I never actually finished the main quest. Instead, I was more entertained by just exploring, going on guild quests, and becoming godlike. As much as I'd love to think this game holds up to the scrutiny of modern gamers, I'm really not sure. The graphics are actually okay, but the gameplay, which is really a big part of the fun in these particular types of RPGs, is a far cry from what it is today. I think you should give it a try, though. If you haven't played Oblivion, you should definitely play that one, because it easily holds up to any modern game, even Skyrim. Let's head back once again to the early 2000s with the release of Final Fantasy X. After the monumental success of Final Fantasy VII, personally, I was disappointed with 8 and 9. Both were decent, but didn't strike me as anything particularly memorable. In fact, I remember very little about either of them despite owning them both, still. But 10 was a different story. It drew me in with a simple storyline that got more and more complicated as the game went on, but always stayed under control. Had a cool battle system, and a soundtrack that is still one of my favorites. With Final Fantasy X, Square successfully got back to the basics of the franchise, while adding enough upgrades to keep it fresh. In that same epoch of time, Suikoden III came out, and it was a total surprise to many gamers, including myself. No, actually, not in a good way, thanks for asking. It was in more of a, oh dear lord, what have you guys done sort of way. And Suikoden IV was even worse. I guess it's really a miracle that I gave 5 a chance at all, but I'm glad I did. Following the same path as the older games, you travel across the country, recruiting 108 Stars of Destiny to go up against a bunch of corrupt douchebags that are in some way related to you. While ties to the older games are few and far between, it's a great game that can stand on its own. A lot like Final Fantasy X, they got back to the basics in all the best ways and added effective, but non-intrusive enhancements that benefited the game itself. And that very same year saw the release of Final Fantasy XII. I'm not gonna lie to you guys, this one wasn't about the story for me. In many ways, Final Fantasy XII is more like a Diablo-style dungeon-crawling loot game than a Final Fantasy game. Yeah, there is a story, and it does a decent job of spurring you on, but screw the story. I mean, just wandering around, grinding, and exploring was way cooler. Gathering all the extra stuff in the game that had nothing to do with anything was where the money was at. You could beat this game and not even have seen 50% of it. So many optional armor, weapons, bosses, espers, entire areas of the game. I know it goes against everything you know about me, but I mean seriously, screw the story, this game essentially didn't need one. So there you have it. 15 games that you should play right now. Except maybe Final Fantasy I, that's optional. But in any case, these games definitely helped define who I am today. I mean, I really don't think it's possible to start doing something at 3 or 4 years old and have it not be a part of who you are. As always, let's talk about some of your favorites in the comments. I'd also like to mention that this video happened because someone sent me a message asking for it. If you have an idea for something you'd like me to talk about, let me know. If it's a topic I'm into and I think I can do it justice, it just might happen.